'Cause heaven or hell is waiting for you.
Let's go! Yes!
What's up, everybody? Welcome to Rock by the Gospel. It's Minister Chris. I'm out here at the park in Burlington, New Jersey on a beautiful spring day. And I was just reflecting on the posture of a worshiper. That's right, the series we started last week, the posture of a worshiper. And today I just want to chop it up about a concept that I believe should be called reflective worship. Sometimes in our worship experiences, they ought to be birthed out of reflection, out of us taking a few minutes and just thinking back to how good God has been and what he's brought you through. Listen, Romans chapter 12 and verse 1 and 2 from the NIV, it says, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God." This is your spiritual act of worship. Paul opens the passage saying, brothers, I urge you, I encourage you, I implore you in view of God's mercy. In other words, when you consider all of the merciful things that God has done for you, how he's covered you when you made mistakes, how he's blessed you even when you didn't deserve it. When you consider God's mercy, then we ought to present our bodies, our lives as living sacrifices to God. Paul is saying, listen, every morning we get new mercies. The Bible says we get new mercies with every day. And as a result of the mercy that God has given you, our response ought to be worship. Our response ought to be in how we live, in the lives that we live in front of people. In fact, he says they ought to be living sacrifices. And you and I both know that sacrifices are dead, but God is saying we ought to be living sacrifices, that we ought to die to our flesh while we're yet living on the earth, while we're walking every day. We ought to be dying to our flesh, dying to our desires, and that is our spiritual act of worship. The King James says it's our reasonable service. It's the least we can do. I want to encourage you today, in view of God's mercy, just think about your own life. Take a few minutes and have a divine rewind and just remember all of the merciful things that God has done for you, how he made a way out of no way, how he healed your body when the doctor said it couldn't be done, how he restored relationships that seemed like they were over and done with. God has been merciful to us. He's covered us when we made mistakes. But even still, God is saying to us today, in view of my mercy towards you, present your bodies or your lifestyles as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to me, because that's our spiritual act of worship. We talked about last week that God is looking for a worshiper, John chapter 4, but guess what? He's not just looking for a worshiper in the congregation of the believers on Sunday morning, on Wednesday nights. He's looking for a worshiper that will worship with their life. Everything they do, they're living a life that is worship to the King. I want to encourage you today to have reflective worship. Just take a few minutes in view of God's mercy. Think about all that he's done. Think about how his compassions fail not. In view of those things, we give God worship. I pray you've been rocked by the gospel.
Good morning. Man, it's so good to know that you and I were not mistakes. But God knew what he was doing when you were brewing in the womb. He predetermined all the steps you would take.